Resuming debate, reprise du débat, the Honourable Member for Churchill-Coatineau-Kaski.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I'm honored to speak in this House in support of a historic piece of legislation, Bill C-35. I want to begin by acknowledging that the hard work of my colleague, the member for Winnipeg Centre, who has worked tirelessly on this bill, who has worked alongside our team to push the Liberals to create a stronger version of this bill on behalf of children, families, Canadian women, and all of us. For me, childcare hits close to home. As many of you know, and certainly as my constituents know, I'm the proud mother of 5-year-old twins. And I, like many mothers in Canada, faced real challenges when it came to accessing childcare after I had my kids. I was on a waiting list for childcare in Ottawa for over 2 years. And then, of course, as soon as COVID hit and knowing that our childcare needs had shifted entirely to here in my constituency in Manitoba, I was again on a waiting list. And of course, like all families, faced the insecurities and, of course, disruptions because of the pandemic. Many that may have tuned in to our online sittings throughout that time would have seen one of even both of my children popping up on Zoom during working hours, because that's what it was like to work from home with kids at home without access to childcare. And while I treasure the time with my kids, as many mothers know, juggling all of that without access to childcare when we want it and when we need it can be a real nightmare. The reality is that the lack of access to childcare in Canada has absolutely held women back, families back. And this legislation is an important step in standing up for women in our country, for families, and for a better future for all of our children. As I begin talking about the speech, I want to say in this speech, I want to say that this victory would not have happened without the decades of activism, of work that has been done by women across our country. I want to acknowledge the groundbreaking work of the National Action Committee on the Status of Women, leaders like Judy Rebick, and the many activists involved in the National Action Committee throughout the country, including people like my mother, who has certainly shaped who I am, Hari Dimitrakopoulou Ashton, who is part of an organization that was very clear that equality for women, justice for women, means childcare. I also want to acknowledge the many women in the labor movement who have fought for decades, tirelessly fought for decades, for access to universal, affordable, not-for-profit childcare. Leaders like Barb Byers, women like Vicky Smallman, the current CLC, President Bea Brusk and her team. And I want to acknowledge women across the country who've made it their aim to speak and fight for childcare. In BC, people like Sharon Gregson, many women here in Manitoba have been part of this fight, recognizing others like Martha Friendly and many more have fought for childcare for decades. And it is them and many others that are the reason we are standing here today. I also want to acknowledge a former colleague who's in the news a fair bit right now, and I think many of us hope soon to be the mayor of Toronto, a New Democrat MP, Olivia Chow, who when she was in Parliament fought tirelessly for childcare, and she was the first to propose an early learning and childcare program for Canadians. Her leadership created the framework for a universal, high-quality, affordable, and non-for-profit national childcare program. New Democrats have long called for universal early learning and childcare in this country, and it's been a long road to get the other parties on board. I'm thinking of long negotiations, even to include this in the supply and confidence agreement with the Liberals. Our demands that this be implemented by the end of the year are the reason we are here. And I am proud that due to NDP pressures, that we will see this bill adopted before the end of 2023. Let's look at the figures. Roughly half of Canadian children under 6 years old don't have access to either licensed or even unlicensed childcare. This impacts primarily women, delaying their capacity to return to work at a time of their choosing. For families that don't have access to childcare, 42% end up postponing their return to work. This is unacceptable. Our current piecemeal system leaves far too many women without the choice to decide for themselves, ourselves, when we can go back to work. Those lost years means less income for women, means fewer opportunities for promotions and furthering careers, and means being punished for starting families. Every day we don't have an early learning and childcare program in Canada is a day where Canada shows the extent to which it devalues women, how little it wants us to succeed. And let's be clear, the provinces know this. Everyone in the House knows this. We've had commission after commission, report after report. Over half a century ago, the Royal Commission on the Status of Women identified publicly funded universal childcare as one of 167 recommendations. For over 30 years, we've heard liberal promises around childcare that was just around the corner, red book after red book during an election, often heard, only to complain how hard it was to enact when they got in government. Far too many women are waiting for far too many men and some women to figure out how to treat us with basic dignity and respect. Whether it's our earning power resembling that of our male counterparts, our capacity to live safely and without fear of violence, equitable abortion access in communities in rural and northern parts of our country, or access to childcare, women in Canada are tired of having to prove their basic humanity. This bill is important, and no one should diminish that. Every parent across Canada deserves access to affordable, accessible, high-quality childcare. This bill enshrines this vision in law and commits the federal government to long-term funding for provinces and Indigenous communities. This bill sets out the vision for a national early learning and childcare system and the principles guiding federal investment in that system. And speaking of funding, we need to be clear. There needs to be long-term, sustainable core funding directed at not-for-profit, accessible, and universal childcare programs. We need to make sure that ECE workers, who are incredible individuals, amongst the most patient people I know, make a living wage and beyond that for the work that they do. We need to make sure that there's investment in infrastructure. And I'm thinking of Indigenous communities here in our region with some of the youngest populations in our country that don't have access to adequate daycare spaces. We need to make sure that the federal government works with First Nations, with Inuit communities, with Indigenous communities across the country to make sure that childcare centers, adequate childcare centers are being built. It's important to acknowledge that this bill establishes a National Advisory Council on Early Learning and Childcare and sets out reporting requirements on the progress being made regarding national childcare and the federal investments being made in the system. Finally, it is meant to contribute towards the realization of the right to childcare services, which is recognized in the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child and the implementation of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. This bill acknowledges Canada's international obligations under the UN Conventions on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and the elimination of all forms of discrimination against women, as well as how a national childcare system must respect the rights of Indigenous peoples as affirmed by the Constitution Act of 1982. Today's work in Parliament and the passing of Bill C-35 is nothing short of historic. But we need to make sure that subsequent governments live up to their obligations in this bill and ensure that there is adequate funding to invest in our most prized resource, our children and our future. I end off by thanking those that have come before us, the feminists, the women, the many people who fought for this day to be a reality and who will continue to fight to make sure that children, women, all of us get the chance and the support that we all deserve. Thank you.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I'd like to thank my colleague for her question. And we had our babies around the same time, so I experienced a lot of the same challenges that she did, although I just had one, whereas she had two at the same time, so I commend her for that. I really want to thank her for her support of this bill. And I really want to thank her for talking about all the advocates who have come before us, because really we stand on their shoulders, and this moment is a result of their hard work. And I couldn't be more appreciative of those advocates who have fought literally for decades to get us to where we are today. I also want to thank her for speaking accurately about the bill. Unfortunately, when the Conservatives were speaking, they said that there was no reporting requirement. However, as my colleague just mentioned, the bill actually already outlines reporting requirements by the government annually to Parliament, and I'm grateful for that. I'm just wondering if she could elaborate on how this is impacting families in her community already, and what difference this is going to make for families in Manitoba, but also across the country. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Honourable Member for Churchill, Coatineau-Aski.
Well, first, I want to acknowledge the minister's work on this critical piece of legislation, and I know it's been very important for us to work with the minister and make sure that the government lives up to the vision that, as the minister pointed out, so many advocates have fought for years. We are absolutely already seeing positive impacts when it comes to investment in childcare. In fact, just a couple of months ago, my neighbor across the street, also the mother of twins, ran over to tell me that that she was one of the families that was going to be able to get reduced childcare fees as a result of our actions in Parliament. And I was so proud that this was already making a difference here in Manitoba, here in the north, where our childcare needs are significant. Right, we're known as being in a childcare desert here, given the demands of our communities. But I also want to acknowledge much work needs to be done when it comes to making sure there's adequate childcare in Indigenous communities, some of the youngest communities in the country with a real lack of infrastructure. So looking forward to this important work.
I have to give the opportunity to another member to ask a question. Honourable Member for Peterborough Court.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you to my colleague. I did not know that she had twins, so that's a great fact. Sometimes when you're sitting around the house here late at night, you get to learn great facts about your colleagues, and twins are definitely a blessing. My question to her would be about what we did in committee when we were studying this bill, and we put this forth, and I actually brought this forth to her leader, and he agreed with me, but we actually put forth an amendment. Conservatives brought forth an amendment to ensure that lower income families were prioritized and not Bay Street lawyers basically were getting priority. And it was voted down. So I'm just curious on her thoughts on that.
Honourable Member for Churchill, Coatineau-Aski.
Well, I would say if the leader was there, or the member was there in the first 2 years of my twins' life, she would have seen them in the house as well. So not prior to Zoom, but. Well, for us in the NDP, what's really important is universal access. That we make sure that all families are having access to affordable childcare, no matter where they live. But we obviously need to have special recognition of the barriers facing low-income families and women that are particularly facing economic hardship. And I think today's legislation is an important step in that direction. But we need to make sure that there's adequate funding that also involves making sure that ECE workers, many of them mothers as well who need childcare, have a living wage, and make sure that we're making the investments necessary in the programming.
Questions and comments, the Honourable Member for Vancouver East.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and I thank my colleague for her comments. And just to touch on exactly the issue around fair wage and working conditions as being essential. As we know, part of the challenge that we face with childcare is the inability to attract and retain childcare workers. Early childhood education workers in the sector. So I wonder if the member can speak to what do we need to do as the government, to support early childhood development workers into the sector and to retain them.
The Honourable Member for Churchill, Coatineau-Aski, 20 seconds.
Well, very clearly, we need to work very closely with early childhood education workers and the sector to make sure that fair wages are prioritized, that there's funding for that, dedicated funding, that we are ensuring that there is oversight of this very important fact, and that we're also investing in ECE education, and making sure that that exactly we are attracting and retaining the best, and who are already doing this work. Making sure that we're continuing to invest in them,